Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on flood response and substantial damage determinations. We're focused on things that local government officials should know about. And I'm Ceil Strauss. I'm the state floodplain manager. I'll be doing most of the presenting today. And Gary Bennett, my assistant, is helping out.
Hi, everybody.
And Gary will be helping watch the chat, but feel free to put questions in chat. And I'm going to turn off my camera for most of this just to help save bandwidth. This is a presentation. It's pretty similar to what I gave last year, but last year I had more on the preparation side. And in order to fit in some more about how the FEMA public assistance, individual assistance stuff works, I took that out, or at least most of it, and want to focus on the post-flood responsibilities, substantial damage determinations. A couple places I'll be talking about the federal declaration process, and especially where that coordinates with you guys at the local level. So we do have on our main DNR floodplain management page, we've got our preparation, response, recovery. On there, we do have a couple of videos. They're about 15 minutes apiece. And this one's got more preparation and forecasting tools. And what I'll be covering today, a lot of that will be in this response and recovery video. We do have a lot of resources that are mentioned in this training and in that video. And just note that you've got to expand this spot here to see all those resources on our flood preparation, response, and recovery page. I did mention that we've given similar training last year, and we have that available on our floodplain training site. And we also did one that was more focused on the recovery process with FEMA that I presented with Brian Killen, who's with FEMA Region 5. And we got some of the FEMA folks, and Matt Bauman gave a presentation that was more focused on mitigation grants and some of those grants that you can use to reduce flood risks. Again, those recordings are on our website in the floodplain training area. And since I'm not talking as much about prep, I did want to remind folks that what had been the main gauge site to see the USGS gauges and other gauges and flood predictions, the AHEPS or the Advanced Hydrologic Prediction Service, that ended last May, and we are now using the National Water Prediction Service. That's the site here. I did have an article in the June 24 Water Talk that talked about how to use this site, gave a few hints on how to see some of the things you were probably used to seeing on the old AHEP site. One thing I noticed just today is that this is a clip from back in June, but when I looked at it today, they had some slightly different things at the top. So I'll have to dig into what they're showing in their extreme precipitation estimates and more water information. That's probably a future Water Talk article, if that's language that's allowed to stay there on that page. Focusing on post-disaster, and this cartoon says recipes for disaster. Of course, during the flood, your main focus at the community level is those first responders are out there doing rescues. They're closing off the roads that are risky, and we're trying to track the time costs for your staff and get some of those high water marks. So here's some photos that we've got of some rescues being done during a flood. And of course, that's the highest priority during the flood, is making sure everybody is safe. You're looking at all these areas that are flooded in your community. And a lot of times the roads do have extreme damage. These ones you can see the damage, but a lot of times the water's on the road, and our transportation folks do get those barriers out there because they know that it's not safe for people to be driving through those areas. And in fact, when flooded, turn around, don't drown. That's one of the mantras there of the National Weather Service folks. And here's another example of a site that was underwater, and that huge section of the bridge got washed out. You would know it because water was covering that area. We do encourage getting high water levels documented. While you can see the high water levels, while you can still see the stain lines and debris lines there. This one they did is kind of a joke there to showing Mary here versus there. But still, there's a lot of places that we are trying to get that high water mark. So you can see the stain, the watermark on this building here. Sometimes we've got DNR or local officials out putting stakes at where the water got to and coming back later when they have a chance to do some surveying. But nowadays, more people have ways to get those GPS coordinates and get the elevations more easily and get some great data. So again, just emphasizing the importance of getting these high water marks so we know how high things really got. We can compare it to the modeling we've got in those areas, see if there's places that we should be looking at updating the modeling because the way the floods actually occurred was different from the way our maps show the flooding occurring. We really encourage you to have a system where you're keeping track of your staff and volunteers and any time they're spending reacting to the floods, because if there is a state or presidential disaster declaration, you're going to need that documentation. Post-flood, the communications, nowadays we've got more options. We've got websites, we've got social media, and I've seen some great examples of communities using social media to get the word out about where there's roads that are impassable, where they can come get sandbags, where there's places for sheltering if it's an extreme flood and buildings are being impacted, homeowners and businesses are being impacted, where to bring debris, all kinds of things that are important to be getting the word out during and immediately after a flood. We do have what we call the Minnesota Post-Flood Playbook. And we step through a lot of the important steps in the process and have some examples of letters and press releases, those kinds of things. Some of what I'll be covering here comes from this playbook. And we did finalize that in 22. We haven't updated recently, but those of you who have been through flooding, if you have suggestions on things that gee, I wish you'd had this in your playbook or that in your playbook, or this part wasn't real understandable. We'd appreciate any comments you've got because we want this to be useful for you at the local level. But one of the first things you're doing is once people are safe and you've taken care of those safety and health hazards is getting out there and figuring out where you've got the damage. And this example I like showing just because you can see it's not high tech at all. This is a situation in a small town where our area hydrologist and the city clerk or administrator went out there and looked at the damage and marked up a version of the FEMA map here. But nowadays we definitely have more technology and can get that information into GIS and be sharing it within the community, within the county, with the state Homeland Security emergency managers. In our guidebook, we do kind of step through what your responsibilities are as a local official, that you do need to determine which buildings are regulated by your local floodplain management ordinance. I should point out that it's not just flooding. This does also apply if you've got a tornado or other kinds of damage in a community that you're looking to see if buildings that are regulated by your floodplain ordinance, if they're damaged due to that disaster. So first thing you're looking at is whether it is in your community, whether it's in the floodplain, and whether it was impacted by that disaster. So in this example, a couple of these are actually in a different community. Some of them are actually in the floodplain. So those are the ones you're going to be focusing your inspections on, is those that are in the FEMA map floodplain and that have any kind of damage from that disaster. We do have this flow chart, which I know some folks, we like to have things in different formats since people find different formats useful, whether it's text or if it's a flow chart or checklists. We've got some checklists in our playbook, and we want it, again, to be useful for you to know what you need to do post-flood. We need to talk about what is considered substantial damage in the floodplain. And that would be mainly, it's going to be those older buildings that were built before you had your floodplain ordinance. After your floodplain ordinance, they should be meeting minimum elevations and meeting your floodplain regs. But those that were built before you had regs, if they were legally built, they're nonconformities. They're allowed to continue to exist. They can do repairs and maintenance, but if they have damage, where the cost to bring it into the pre-damage condition is more than 50% of the market value of the building, that's considered substantial damage. And a couple things to remind us of here is it's any origin. So it could be a flood, it could be a tornado, it could be a fire. Doesn't matter what kind of disaster it is, that all of those apply. And you're looking at comparing the cost to do the repairs, whether they actually do the work or not, whether they actually perform that repair. Because sometimes people say, well, I'm just going to repair part of my house, so I stay under 50%. That's not the way the rule works. The rule says, what would it cost to do the repairs to get your house back to what you had before that flood, before that tornado? And you're comparing the cost of doing that work to the market value of the building. You're not including the land value when you're making that comparison. And when do you want to get out there and do that? As some say, you want to do it while the fish are still flopping on the couch. You want to get out there right away. And here's an example of some folks out there doing inspections. A lot of times you'll have folks from different departments out there helping with the inspections. Certainly the local community. You may have folks from Homeland Security Emergency Management out there looking at preliminary damage assessments. You may have other groups of insurance assessors out there looking at damage. After a flood, there tends to be a lot of different inspections going on. But some of the more important ones that you're looking at the local level would be someone's out there looking to see if that building's habitable. And they will possibly put up a red placard saying, nope, not habitable, it's not safe to go in this building. Or a green one saying, okay, we've inspected it, it's okay to be in here. Or the assessor's office is out there often checking on how much damage there is, because that makes a difference in the property taxes for that following year. Local zoning authorities should be out there checking whether they've had damage and they need repair permits, or if they're substantially damaged. Mentioned the flood insurance adjusters. And then there could be other state, federal folks out there doing those preliminary damage assessments. Here's an example of a placard where it's not considered habitable. So preliminary damage assessments, that's done as part of the process to determine if it's a big enough flood that there's going to be a federal or state disaster declared. And the main folks involved would be Homeland Security Emergency Management and local officials. But if it's a bigger flood, you might have reps from FEMA, you might have some health folks out there, you might have some DNR folks. Mainly it's going to be local officials and Homeland Security Emergency Management. They're looking at whether there's enough damage to public infrastructure or to homes and businesses. And if it's public infrastructure, that's called public assistance. If it's homes and businesses, are looking at whether they're eligible for individual assistance. Some others in a big flood that are out there are the VOAD organizations, the volunteer organizations. Think about places like the American Red Cross. Those preliminary damage assessments, they're usually done fairly quickly after event because they want to get out there quickly while they can see the damage and determine if there needs to be a federal or state declaration. And sometimes they they're doing those emergency declarations where they're doing them really quick and they haven't done as much detailed inspection. Just note that if they are looking at whether there should be an individual assistance declaration, they're mainly looking at the outsides of the homes and businesses, and they're just looking at whether it's going to be a minor, major, or destroyed, and if they think there's enough damage to have that declaration. Those inspections are not adequate for your substantial damage inspections, but they can help inform what part of the city, what part of the county do we need to be looking at more carefully for that damage. And again, public assistance, that's all about emergency response efforts and damage to public buildings, public infrastructure, your roads, culvert crossings, utility lines, those kinds of things. And individual assistance is if a lot of homes and businesses are damaged. Now, there is a threshold. The statewide threshold last year was $10.5 million to be eligible for public assistance declarations, to even be considered whether they're going to have a declaration. And then which counties get included, they've got minimum amounts of damage that need to be shown. And it's based on a per capita estimate there. Homeland Security Emergency Management had this 2-page info sheet on their website. I wasn't finding the link there now here recently, but I'm sure if we get into a disaster period that they'll put up the most recent version of what they've got. But there are a couple nice general sites. FEMA's got a little video on how a disaster gets declared. It's not too long. And Homeland Security Emergency Management's disaster recovery page has a lot of good information to help you understand when presidential declarations are made. In general, the state declarations, they take half of whatever the trigger is for the presidential declarations. And that's something unique in Minnesota. Other states don't have those same kind of state declarations, but we've had some pots of money since 2014, the disaster assistance contingency account there, so that communities can get that help, even if there's not enough damage to trigger a federal disaster declaration. And we've had many state disaster declarations. So, okay, here's where it's pointing out state declaration thresholds 50% of the federal. And again, some of this information on the Homeland Security Emergency Management site can be really helpful. This is just zooming in on what was on that page I was showing. In 23, we did have presidential declarations for a good portion of the state. You can see more about that declaration, that incident. There's a link here to the incident. It's Declaration 4722. When you're talking with FEMA and the Homeland Security Emergency Management folks, they really focus in on this number of the disaster recovery, the 4722 and whatever the disaster is. That's what they tend to talk about. And it'll cover a particular incident period, and they'll note the day it got declared. Again, we've got a couple videos that are helpful. When we're talking about public assistance categories, they'll tell you which categories got declared, in this case, A through G. And basically, A and B are your emergency work situations, help with reimbursing for the cost to do the debris removal, and your folks out there doing the emergency protective measures. So rescuing folks, putting up the barriers, sandbagging if you need to do that. Some of those kinds of things you're doing to protect the public health and safety. That assistance available to all communities. But then when we're talking about the permanent work categories, if categories C, D, E, F, and G get declared, that reimbursement is only available to participating communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. Homeland Security's got a little bit more full list. That link's not working right now either, but basically they have just a sheet that shows here, you hear a little bit more about what's included in each of those categories. Again, if you do have a federal or state declaration, those are important to know more about. And your emergency managers should be very familiar with this. Your first responders may know more about it, but we think it's good for those of you on the planning and zoning side, or just those working more on engineering and not necessarily flood response. It's good for you to be aware of these things also. The more recent flood was a bigger one in that we actually had public assistance and individual assistance. So the counties that are kind of this pinkish, they have both individual assistance and public assistance declarations. And then there are a few other counties that just had public assistance declarations. And that's not very common in Minnesota to have individual assistance. We were talking with some of the FEMA folks on some things that they thought communities should be aware of about individual assistance, and suggested we include in this training is that if you do have the individual assistance declaration, there will be either Homeland Security Emergency Management or FEMA folks out knocking on doors, checking on whether folks have a place to sleep, whether they can cook, whether their bathrooms are functional, looking at whether the building's actually habitable or not. That's part of what they're looking at for individual assistance. When that individual assistance is declared, they will set up these disaster recovery centers, or DRCs, and they look at where you've got concentrations of damage, where the people are who need help. And sometimes they'll be in an actual building and they'll have a longer period of time. They'll have more staff there. And sometimes it might be a mobile van if they're trying to serve some areas that maybe don't have as much damage, but they want to get the help out closer to where the damage is. Part of what they will remind communities and remind citizens of is about scammers. That those FEMA folks who are going door to door, they're not asking for credit cards or passwords or social security numbers, that kind of thing, if they're going around door to door. But if you're at that actual disaster recovery center and you're applying for aid, then they will ask if you have flood insurance. They'll ask for your income information, social security numbers, and verifying that you're the actual homeowner. You're not someone who's trying to scam the system, trying to ask for aid to a building that's not theirs. And note that even if there is individual assistance declaration, most of the aid is in the form of loans. And a lot of times the SBA, the Small Business Administration, they'll have separate declarations sometimes. So there may be differences in the counties that have an SBA declaration where loans are available and the individual assistance in general. I wanted to mention that the maximum grant you can get with individual assistance is, well, it changes each year, but it's currently $42,500. What we actually see is more typically in the 5,000 range. And here in the 24 floods, based on the actual data, what they gave out to almost 4,000 families, averaged 3,500 range. Whereas they pointed out that the average flood insurance claim was $35,000, and that was data as of October 2024. So FEMA does like to point out that even though people think FEMA's coming and handing out money to folks in disaster areas, that's not happening. The most common disaster declarations we see are the public assistance for the roads, infrastructure. That's something we continue to have damage during floods, but we've done a better job of reducing the number of buildings in floodplains, and those that have been built in the last 50 years have been built in a safer area or elevated, and we don't see as much damage. So these red marks are showing Minnesota disasters. Some of them you don't see it's kind of a teal color showing the average individual assistance grant. A lot of them don't show any because even though we might have had a disaster declaration, we didn't get individual assistance declared. And in the years where we did have individual assistance, it's much smaller than the average flood insurance claim. So this is a FEMA info sheet that just shows some of the different folks that might be coming and doing inspections related to insurance, folks looking to see if it's going to be a public assistance or individual assistance declared county. and then just others that might be out there. But let's get back to what are your responsibilities as a local official? That you're going to be reviewing those damaged buildings in the areas that you regulate. And again, even if the damage is tornado or maybe a bigger fire or something like that, you'll be out there doing initial screening and looking at, gee, is that building clearly substantially damaged? Then you're going to note that. Those that are clearly not substantial damage but had some damage, you're going to point out, yeah, we know they're not substantially damaged. We're going to give them a repair permit. And a reminder that in your ordinance, it does say you need to give out repair permits after disasters. And that's one of the things that FEMA required us to make sure we have in our model ordinance. And I think a lot of it's because they do want you to document, hey, we've looked at this house, they're doing repairs, we gave them a permit to do the repair, but then also making sure that that's all they do. Because sometimes when people are in there doing their repairs, hey, I got a contractor here, I've been meaning to do these improvements, I've been meaning to do this addition. But if they're doing improvements at the same time they're doing repairs, that all gets added up and they compare that to the market value of the house, and they could be putting themselves into a substantial improvement situation, which requires them to bring the building into compliance with your current regs also. The ones that you're going to need to spend more time on, typically they're the ones that your initial screening, you think that the damage could be, anywhere from, like 35% to 60, 70%. You're going to need to look more closely to figure out if it's under or over that 50% trigger that is substantial damage. A lot of times you'll have a pretty good idea of where the damage is because you know where the water level got high, and then after floods you see all the debris out there by the houses. So you can be looking around your community to see where that debris is and making sure you've looked at those buildings. As I say, some of the determinations are easy. They've been totally destroyed, lifted off their foundation and shifted. Those ones are easy to say that's substantial damage. FEMA does have information on determining substantial damage. This one's a little shorter one that hits more of the highlights. A lot of the time you're able to go and look at where those stain lines are. Here looks like it's an accessory building and it's metal and concrete. Well, if they just had a little bit of flooding on a building like that, you know that, and they've just got the typical storage in there, it's not substantial damage because that kind of material is not damaged by the flooding if it's that flood resistant materials like that. But you get into areas where there has been more damage, you're documenting where that damage is, making sure you've got plenty of pictures. You can't have too many pictures is what we hear from folks who have been more involved in this process. But showing where you had the damage, and a lot of times if it's in the basement, you might have a destroyed furnace, water heater. Maybe it got up high enough it damaged the electric. But even then, sometimes you don't have substantial damage if the damage was just in the basement and they didn't have real foundation problems. But you need to document it. Here, one more picture. Someone documenting how high the water got. But you can't just look at the outside. And that's why those preliminary damage assessments are not good enough, because you don't get a full look at what the damage could be. So here we can see a mud line in the front of the house. Doesn't look that bad. But if you go around and look even on the back of the house, you see they had much more substantial impact here and likely had substantial damage. And one more example of some extensive damage. Yeah, Winona County was nice and provided lots of their photos that they had from past floods. In our playbook, we do look at some ways to estimate damage, and if it's one story slab on grade and they've got water on that main story, they're much more likely to have substantial damage, especially if they've got 2-3 feet on that main level. If it's 2-story and it got just up on the the first level, it's got to be deeper before you're more likely to have substantial damage. And depending on what kind of materials they've got, manufactured homes in general, if they got any water on that building, they're substantially damaged. We hear that consistently in past floods. And here it shows if they've got half a foot of water, they're likely substantially damaged. Zooming in on the one story again, if they've got a few feet of water, they're more likely to be substantially damaged. Those are the ones you're really going to want to focus your attention. If it's a building with a basement and they didn't get water onto the main floor, it's less likely to be substantial damage. Why are we caring about whether they're substantially damaged? Because your ordinance and federal regs say if they're substantially damaged, that they must rebuild in compliance with your floodplain ordinance. Again, if they were built legally before you had an ordinance, they're allowed to continue to exist. But once they're substantially damaged, they need to be elevated, so their lowest floor is at the regulatory flood protection elevation, or they can use an alternative elevation method where maybe they've got the perimeter walls with the flood vents, but they've got to bring the building into compliance. I think I showed this earlier, just a reminder of what substantial damage definition is. Substantial improvement is similar, but they're looking at reconstruction, rehabilitation, additions, or other improvements. And they're looking at what was the building's market value before the start of the damage and the improvements. They don't include anything that was red tagged. If it was tagged by a local official ahead of time, they can't do improvements and say, oh, well, I had these existing health and safety violations. It has to have been identified by a government official. When it's a historic structure and they're actually on the federal register or state register, there are different ways we look at substantial damage. They basically are exempt from having to do some of the elevation requirements. If you have historical buildings in your community, you'll want to take a look at this FEMA document and talk to us at DNR in more detail about what they can and can't do if they're a historic building. A good desk reference, and I think they're working on an update of this because this did come out back in 2010, but this desk reference is kind of the main source for some good information on doing substantial improvement, substantial damage determinations. And it's probably a good half-inch thick, but they do have it available as a PDF. And in there, they've got some nice little flow charts to help you figure out what part of the desk reference you want to use. Was it likely to be substantial damage? What do you need to do to require compliance? Encouraging building in a more flood-resistant way, even if it's not substantially damaged. How do you get the market value? Usually what we're recommending is that you're looking at what was the county assessor using. Sometimes counties aren't using the full market value, but in Minnesota, they're usually very close. My understanding is that the market values, the assessed values that they use are supposed to be within 90% of what the market value is. And they show the building values separate from the land value in the county records. So that's a great place to start. If folks say, hey, you know, the county assessor, we think they're way off, we think our building's much more valuable than that, they can always have an appeal process. Usually you're going to have them obtain an official appraisal. And then if they do show their building's more valuable, you're going to be sharing that with your assessor's office for future property tax purposes. We do, in our sample floodplain permit form, have a section that's in the part for the local zoning officials where we kind of step through what you would use to get estimates of what are the costs of the improvements. Especially in those places, again, you're in that 40 to 60% damage range, and you need to look more carefully at whether they have substantial damage or not. You need to be looking at preferably those contractors who work in the area, what their estimates are. Sometimes the building officials or zoning office might be able to do some good estimates, but what are you using for those records? and is it substantially damaged or not. In the FEMA substantial improvement, substantial damage desk reference there, they do have some nice information on what things must be included. And one of the things that we point out is that you've got to look at the actual value of anything that was donated or discounted and the value of that labor. Someone can't just say, well, I'm fixing it all myself and it's volunteered labor, or I got a case of beer and I got some friends helping me here. No, that's not what is allowed in coming up with what the cost is to do those repairs. Another one is they specifically note that it should include typical contractors' overhead and profits. Again, you can be looking at this desk reference, and if people want to argue about what gets included, show them these pages. Hey, this is what FEMA says we have to include and what we can exclude. So things that can be excluded would be survey costs, permit fees, the cleanup and trash removal, some of these kinds of things. You've looked at a building and it appears that it's substantially damaged, you need to send a formal letter saying, this is what we've determined, and you must now bring your building into compliance. And we advise that you include a paragraph about if they have a flood insurance policy, advise them they're eligible for the ICC, the increased cost of compliance coverage. It's like a rider on their flood insurance and gives them up to $30,000 to pay for the cost to elevate or bring the building into compliance. This is the sample letter we've got in our playbook. That's pretty much out of the FEMA substantial improvement, substantial damage desk reference. Again, if they have flood insurance, they are eligible to get that up to $30,000. It's good for floodproofing if it is a non-residential building, relocating to maybe another part of their lot, elevating, or the cost to demolish. So Fred tells you the things that it's eligible for. And in order to get that ICC coverage, they have to have that local floodplain administrator has to do that determination that there's substantial damage and tell them that they've got to bring them into compliance. They will look for that letter from you as local officials saying that it is substantially damaged. So here's an example actually from Illinois on the Mississippi River. Building was substantially damaged. They got flooded and they got their ICC money, and that helped them to elevate that building. This alternative elevation method, which in Minnesota communities, it's a CUP to do this. So the flood resistant materials, the automatic flood openings. This is a picture from Rock County, Illinois, where they're like the champions of doing a lot of ICC projects. In our state model ordinance, we do have, of course, you have to have the language saying if it's more than the 50%, that's substantial damage. But we also have language in there it's referred to as the repetitive loss language. And if it's in your ordinance and they have a repetitive loss, they can also get the ICC money if they've got flood insurance policy. So we've had that in our model ordinance for over a decade. Many communities did adopt that. And basically, you've got repetitive loss defined in the definition section as flood damage 2 times within 10 years, where that damage is an average of 25% each time. So the 2 damage situations together are over 50%. And we really encourage this because over time we want buildings brought into compliance. We want people to be able to take advantage of that ICC money. I know of at least a couple communities here in the last year or two who did add in that language because they had some people who would have been eligible. They had been damaged more than twice in a 10-year period, but it wasn't in the local ordinance. So now if they get another flood, those buildings will be eligible to get that help in elevating the building. So moving back to the federal disaster declarations, that if there is public assistance disaster declaration, that process is going on basically at the same time you're out there looking at substantial damage and helping people to get back in and do repairs and do what they need to do. But this is the overall process. I'm not going into detail here today, but we did kind of break this up in a presentation we gave last year, talking about some of those first steps that once they've done the preliminary damage assessment and they've had the declaration, within the first month after the declaration, they should be having applicant briefings. More recently, they're more virtual. In the past, they've been in person, usually led by Homeland Security Emergency Management and typically by the county at the county level. Then there's the process for basically applying for the different things that need assistance. And the next big step is they have these recovery scoping meetings. So communities will have a FEMA case manager and a public assistance staff will take over, but it's about 3 months after the disaster. So they're not out there right away taking care of some of those things. Again, why you want to be documenting what you have been doing so that you can get reimbursed for everything that's eligible. And then the other steps here in the process where they're checking what you've done and inspecting and getting the reimbursements out there. From a FEMA slide here, the big ones are that applicant briefing, that's within a month of the declaration, that recovery scoping meeting, and the inspections. One thing I will mention is that part of the inspection and process to determine that those projects were done properly is making sure proper permits were given for the work that's in the mapped floodplain. Looking at repairing damage, one of the things we like to encourage is that you look at, does it make sense to replace it in kind? Is that culvert that got blown out something you should put back as an undersized culvert that you know is going to get blown out again? And there is something called the Section 406, where they will help with the cost to replace it in a safer way. And one of the examples they actually give in the guidance is something they call a relief culvert, which is basically the same as what we call floodplain culverts. Now, I will note that, and this is Appendix J, and it's mentioned there, I will note that they just came out with the 25 guidance here, an update to that, but they still have that same Appendix J, and they still talk about the relief culvert being one of the examples here. And that's something we definitely encourage when we're in the final phases after the flooding, is doing what we can to reduce future damage. Well, this one was substantially damaged. They did elevate. I believe it involved ICC, if I recall correctly. Sometimes it may not have been substantially damaged, but we're still encouraging doing things in a more resilient way. If it wasn't 50% damage, you can't require them to elevate some of these things, but you can encourage it, and you can have higher standards in your ordinance saying if basic utilities like the furnace or the water heater are damaged and have to be replaced, that they do need to be placed higher and meet the regulatory flood protection elevation. I know in the 2012 flood that Duluth was telling folks that they had to elevate their furnaces when they were being replaced, and they did get some pushback. And when we worked with the city, we had to say, your ordinance doesn't actually require that. It's a good idea. It's good to encourage it, but you need to put wording in your ordinance to require that if you're going to say that's a requirement.
Ceil, we do have a question in the
Okay.
comments if you have time to answer it.
Sure.
They're asking about culvert sizing and if there's any way to recommend that they upsize a culvert based on a study that the community may have done when a recommendation has already been made for, I think, something else is kind of their question.
I think we're trying to see improvements in making sure that folks are looking at upsizing where it makes sense. And FEMA is helping to pay for those increases. Well, especially now that we've got the federal flood risk management standards, and they're saying that if there's federal money helping with the repairs, which that would include if they're getting reimbursed post-flood, that if a culvert is substantially damaged, and they define that as the cost to do the repair is more than 50% of the cost to put in a new culvert, that they need to build them in a resilient manner, which we would argue is looking at what the right size is based on that local study, or looking at the floodplain culverts. And that's something we're hoping to have better coordination on, better guidance on the next time we have a declaration. But FEMA paying for, I'm seeing Dan's question about FEMA paying for elevating the utilities in the crawl space. FEMA's paying for the public infrastructure. If it's a public building, then I think that they would be helping to pay for that. But if it's a home, then, or a business, that's individual assistance, and they just pay for making it a livable situation. They're not paying to make it compliant with the floodplain regs. I see Tamara is getting in there and pointing out that, yeah, for public assistance, if it's a public building, they'll help pay for those kinds of things. But that's why we really encourage for the homes and businesses to think about having some higher language in your ordinance, because it's the community that's responsible for having them build back safer. FEMA doesn't get involved in making sure they're compliant, or you don't have the substantial damage trigger for the FEMA assistance. They're really just looking at, is it a safe place? Do you need some money to live someplace temporarily and to do cleanup for some of that kind of stuff? Insurance, boy, they will pay for restoring what was there. But those are some good questions there, Dan. That'd be something to get a little bit more information about what insurance covers. But to my understanding, they'll pay to replace that furnace, and there might be some additional costs to get it into a new part of the house, and they probably won't pay for that. Maybe some good follow-up questions. Unfortunately, yeah, that's not a good incentive for insurance, that people are finding out it doesn't pay for what they think it should pay for. When we do the education on the flood insurance, we're very open about this is what it does cover. So we're working with Homeland Security Emergency Management, need to get applicable permits. If it does involve a public water and needs a DNR permit, we get the general permit for repair of flood damages. If there is a federal declaration that makes that permit applicable, also our regional managers can say, hey, we've got severe flooding in this area. We're making this general permit for repair of public infrastructure that's kicking in now in these counties. Our folks, that Jen Sorensen, who I know is on the call, and others can help communities with that general permit if you've got questions. But again, we don't necessarily want to put back in what's there. And as I mentioned, I should have added a slide here reminding us of the federal flood risk management standards, that the FEMA rules came into place in September last year. So any new federal disaster declarations, they will have those requirements that if infrastructure is damaged more than 50%, that they're rebuilding it in a resilient way. And that really makes a difference when we're talking about culverts and bridge crossings, and making sure that they are built in a way that they have the capacity for the flows we see during a 100-year flood or bigger. Funding for reducing future damage. There are a lot of federal grants, and we have our state hazard mitigation grants. Unfortunately, there's no money in the pot for our state grants right now. We'll see what happens in the current legislative session. We did have that separate presentation I mentioned at the beginning about federal grants and state grants. We will send out a PDF of the slides, and I'll include links to some of those related trainings for information. It's important that your county all hazard plans are up to date. And this is an old, I'm sure there's a newer version of this Goodhue County one, because I think they get updated every 5 years. Looking at grant options, identifying priority areas for mitigation, because for some of those grants, they do need to be mentioned in that county all hazard plan. Looking at what are those areas that you want to be doing repair in the future, considering that in your local plans, in that all hazard plan. That's a time when many people are more willing to sell properties. And so, especially where you've got a concentration of buildings that are being impacted during floods, repetitive losses, that's when some of our communities are able to come in and get buyouts, because we really only work with willing sellers for the federal grants and for the state grants. It's important to be chipping away and doing these projects. Here's a picture from '97. They talked about how slippery and wet it was, and realizing that they were really putting people at risk with helping doing the sandbagging in that area. Afterwards, this is in this Granite Falls example, this is where the city hall used to be. They bought out a lot of these buildings and made it into public open space so that they didn't need to be doing the human chains of sandbagging to protect the buildings here and putting their citizens at risk. Another example in Moorhead, where these buildings on the riverside have been bought out, well, except there's one holdout here because they're only working with willing sellers. But then they were able to put in a little levee here and protect the rest of the buildings. East Grand Forks definitely saw flooding in 1997. They came and they had kind of a levee here, wasn't in the greatest condition, but they put in a new levee that was back further from the river, allowed more room for the river during a flood, made it so that this is all park areas and areas that weren't impacted as much by flooding, getting the homes out of there. We do have more information just on flood preparation, response, recovery, as I mentioned at the beginning. And if you want to see more about the mapping of what's the floodplain, that's here. Reminding that when it's a flood, you're out there, all hands on deck, saving people, making sure that they're safe. But once we have those dry periods, we want to be working on preparing for the future. But I see Gary's commenting that East Grand Forks, they did pretty well during the more recent floods. And I've talked to other communities, them and Montevideo and Granite Falls and some, Austin, Moorhead, all those communities can give examples of how their costs were much less and preparing for more recent floods that were similar magnitudes to ones that devastated communities in the past. As I mentioned, we will send out a PDF of the slides to everybody who registered here. And we can stick around. If there are any other questions, you can either put them in the chat or take yourself off mute. But I'd like to say thanks for coming today, and I hope it was helpful. If you have comments on things you wish that we did cover more in depth, or if there's things that we're getting into too much here, we want these presentations, these trainings to be useful for you guys at the local level. So again, thanks for coming to our training today.